So my goal here is now to do all the stuff Scott said I would do. But before I get there, what I really want to do is try to delineate implicit and statistical learning for you guys. They are confusing for a lot of people. I'll talk sort of, the basic stuff, definitions, so I know Ron will be excited if it's definitions. I'll talk about sort of what we know, what the state of the art is, and then I'll pivot to try to talk more about some of those connections with cross-linguistic influence and transfer, and then that'll sort of, I think, hopefully steer us in the right direction. I'm apparently standing in the squeaky spot on the floor, so it's not bad back there, but I don't think people normally stand back here. Anyways, so a little bit about where I'm coming from, but my slides won't move. How do I do it? What do I do? Make something happen. Do you want to use the clicker? Yeah, if you have a clicker, that'd be great. So use a slideshow. Oh, the enter button works. That'll work just fine. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it. So a little bit about where we're coming from here. I'm throwing you guys back to 1998 with a seminal article in the fields of implicit learning and statistical learning. Note, my sort of subtitle for my little part of the presentation is actually a nod to this. And if you actually look through the abstract and some of the things I've highlighted here, this particular paper, 21 years ago, is outlining some of the same questions that we still have today. For better or for worse, those are some of the same questions. But I really wanted to point out this one right here about distributional knowledge, which is another way of saying statistical knowledge. And this idea had been bounced around for a long time, but implicit learning people hadn't really thought of it this way too much. And it starts to push implicit and statistical learning a little more toward one another. Fast forward to 2006, all right, brief history here of implicit statistical learning, and you get a special issue in the same journal, Trends in Cognitive Sciences, and a lot of people come forward, Pierre Perichet, Morten Christensen, and they say, you know what, we really should be talking to each other. Implicit learning and statistical learning, two different fields, they're really not talking to each other, and we have a lot to offer one another. In fact, they go so far as to say, you know what, I think we're talking about the same thing, all right? And that's an important point. So if we look at the past 20 years with this idea of implicit statistical learning, if you actually look at the citations, the number of publications with implicit statistical learning listed as a construct, you can see where we were about 20 years ago, and you can see where we are now. It's exploded, this idea of implicit statistical learning. That makes perfect sense. Implicit learning researchers need to be talking to statistical learning researchers, and vice versa. But I want to pump the brakes just a little bit here, okay? Because there are reasons to distinguish these different constructs that I think is important not only for our field of implicit statistical learning, but also for CLI, applied linguistics more broadly. So let's do a little bit of that delineation. Some definitions. I'm going to try to keep it as simple as I can for the time constraints. Implicit learning is often referred to as learning without awareness. This can be the process, Ron, learning, process. I just want to make sure he knows that I said it. Learning without awareness, the process of learning, or we could refer to the product, what has been learned. And we could say that that is implicit. For example, if people are not aware that they know something, or if they don't have conscious access to that knowledge. Contrast, if you will, statistical learning, which simply refers to the learning of, or from, or both distributional or statistical properties of the input. Now, I've made this little table for you guys here to, hopefully draw some points of comparison as well as some points of contrast between the two constructs. These hold broadly in the fields, okay? So, for example, we can look at implicit learning. We say, well, they're learning without awareness. Well, yes, that's part of the definition of the word. Contrast this with statistical learning. If we think of statistical learning as learning that happens by the brain somehow non-consciously, it has to be not conscious, computing statistical information, that's not conscious. People aren't sitting around tallying the frequencies consciously that Scott was talking about. They aren't computing transitional probabilities or Bayesian priors. I know you love the priors. They're not doing that stuff consciously, if that's what they're doing. However, you will see people, myself included, argue that actually, you know what? Some statistical learning can be explained by explicit or conscious chunk formation. All right, whatever's in your attentional focus, which is usually conscious, becomes a chunk. All right, and that actually can explain a lot of the statistical learning data. I'll come back to this point momentarily. So here again, implicit statistical learning, learning without awareness potentially, but also statistical learning maybe with awareness. If we look at resulting knowledge, for example, we would often say that implicit learning results in implicit knowledge. Makes sense. But we do see people out there who claim, for example, that the function of implicit learning is to shape our conscious experience. We're not aware of all the processes going on, but the output is an adjustment to our conscious experience of the world. If you think about speech perception, speech development in the first year of life, that critical period, that sensitive period for the first language, where your brain fixates, tunes in to the sounds of your native language or languages, and then all of a sudden, you don't hear those sounds that are in other languages the same way. Quite literally, your conscious experience of the sounds of language change in that first year. So this kind of makes sense too. Statistical learning, we can more clearly just say, yeah, there's some evidence that we have implicit knowledge as well as explicit knowledge that comes out of it. Again, I'll unpack that more in a second. We can talk about both forms of learning as being learning of distributional or statistical regularities, although I'll point out that a lot of people talk about implicit learning in terms of the implicit learning of rules or constraints, and these need not be statistical in nature necessarily. Finally, these constructs are often measured with somewhat overlapping tasks. For example, the SRTT that you see up there, that's the serial reaction time task. Right? You'll see this get used in studies, and it will be labeled as a measure of implicit learning, statistical learning, procedural learning, if you're me or, for example, Michael Ullman. And this is important because what we're doing is kind of taking the same task and we're assigning radically different, potentially radically different theoretical interpretations to it. This will actually be important, I think. I'm writing that screen for you guys. Does that help you too? No, just me. Okay. So this could be potentially important for those of you who are interested in doing this kind of research, especially if you're wanting to do some CLI or transfer research and import some of these tasks, especially as individual differences. It'll be important to think very clearly about how you measure these things. Again, we'll come back to that. So with all that having been said, with the delineation between implicit learning and statistical learning, with the sort of the boundary is drawn here. We see that they overlap in certain places. We see that in other places they don't quite line up. I want to go into the state of the art, and specifically I want to focus on statistical learning, okay? For a couple of reasons, some of which I outline here, okay? Now, SLA I think is just broadly much more acquainted with notions of implicit learning and explicit learning, all right? But I'm not going to go down that road. For one, I would argue that SLA has problems with assessing implicitness. That's the nicest way I can put it. And I'm not saying this to point the finger at other people, right? I do a lot of research in this area, and I'm the one of many people who's trying to figure it out. And often I'm doing this to myself, going, "What are you doing? This is a terrible idea." Right? It's hard to measure this. And I even argued, along with some of my other colleagues, that we might actually want to reject awareness as the key criterion for looking at implicit learning to begin with. If you want to know more, feel free to ask afterwards. I'll tell you about that. But beyond that, it's also clear that statistical learning is a thing, right? Whether you're looking at corpus linguistics, psycholinguistics, statistical learning, language acquisition studies, we see these effects of frequencies, dispersion, transitional probabilities, all this stuff, all over the place. No one sort of debates that it's a thing, and yet, it's a rather poor construct in terms of its definition. Right? If we see a frequency effect, if we see delta P, which is a kind of statistical learning, we just go, "Oh, it's statistical learning," and we just sweep it all into the same category. But that's not good enough. We need to be more specific about what we're talking about. So I'm going to put to you two broad points to establish the state of the art in statistical learning. All right. What I'll be saying describes research done in the cognitive sciences, in second language acquisition, applied linguistics. But I'd like to say that these are the things that you can put your money on. Okay? If you're not familiar with the area of statistical learning and you just sort of want a quick, what do we know, where are we right now, this is, I'm going to argue, it. Okay? Pretty straightforward. Statistical learning is not a unitary phenomenon. and it is the byproduct of more general learning and memory mechanisms. Let's see if I can convince you of this here. Okay. I will note, since I'm kind of giving implicit learning a little bit of a short shrift at the moment, that the things I'm about to say are also true of implicit learning, and if you don't believe me, ask one of these people, find the one you trust most, and listen to them, because they'll say the same thing. Okay? Nick Ellis says the same thing. Morton Christensen says the same thing. Michael Ullman says the same thing. There's other people too, but these are the ones I at least know because I've talked to them and said, what do you think? And they go, yeah. All right? So, moving forward. First point that I want to make. Okay? Statistical learning, not a unitary phenomenon. Now, why is this even a point that I have to make? Well, because our initial observations suggested otherwise. Okay? For the bulk of the history of statistical learning research, so we're talking from the mid-90s, okay, people have been looking particularly at a kind of statistical learning, a statistical computation of something called a transitional probability, which I'll explain in more detail later, but basically it has to say, given event A, what's the likelihood that it's followed by event B? And we can describe this with a probability. Okay? Well, what we found was that people were sensitive to something like transitional probability in a whole lot of different domains of learning. Linguistic learning, non-linguistic but still auditory learning, visual learning of patterns and shapes that are recognized, as well as abstract nonsense shapes that don't have any semantic content to them. Okay? And so we go, hey, it must be this statistical learning thing somewhere. That's what a mechanism means, right? When we're doing research and we say it's a statistical learning mechanism, what we mean is it's a thing that does something. All right, so there must be one of these. We have reason to believe that this isn't actually the case. For one, and this is just one point that I'm making here, statistical learning is influenced by the modality in which you learn. For example, statistical learning abilities in visual and auditory domains are uncorrelated within an individual, meaning that your particular visual statistical learning abilities is not correlated or predictive of your auditory statistical learning abilities, and vice versa, which would suggest some amount of independence between these two. Okay? Learners can simultaneously statistically learn two different grammars in different modalities. So for example, auditory versus visual, and transfer limit of learning is limited across these. So if you learn a grammar in the visual modality, you have a hard time transferring that to the auditory and vice versa. Okay? Finally, we see that visual statistical learning seems to improve with age, whereas auditory statistical learning doesn't change much with age. There's a little bump in the first year of life, or at least it seems to be that way. So again, all of this stuff converges on this bigger picture, which is that statistical learning is not a unitary phenomenon, and involves distinct learning systems, which may partially overlap. I feel uncomfortable saying it any more firmly than that. As we'll see, there's this whole idea of saying that they're completely distinct is always a little bit tricky, even in the presence of double dissociations. Okay, so that's premise one. Statistical learning is not a unitary phenomenon. My second main point here is that statistical learning is essentially a byproduct of more general learning and memory systems. Okay? I often will use the word elementary, but that implies simple, but it doesn't necessarily need to. Good. What did it actually say? I couldn't hear it. Oh, okay. It sounded scary. Anyways. Often when we talk about statistical learning, there's been sort of a subgroup within statistical learning research that looks at statistical learning as a really complex phenomenon involving, for example, Bayesian inference. Okay? Really complex statistical computations of prior probability distributions and things like that. And it must be going on non-consciously. You go, oh, that sounds really cool and interesting. And there's a lot of evidence that those kinds of Bayesian models of statistical learning do a pretty good job of explaining human behavior. Now, I and several other people have a problem with those kinds of models based on evolutionary reasons. It seems rather complicated, but that doesn't mean it's not the truth or the way that the mind works. The mind is a rather complicated organism. That said, we do see that statistical learning happens with more elementary simpler learning mechanisms. So for example, those you see in a connectionist neural network, this here is a simple recurrent network, which learns by prediction and error-based feedback. It says, given all the stuff I've already done before, what's the likelihood that this is going to happen next? It generates an expectation. It then adjusts its network weights in accordance with whether it got the answer right or wrong. This is relatively simple associative learning mechanisms. And what do we see? If you compare this with the more complex statistical learning models of human cognition, this usually explains the data just as well. Okay. Does that mean that the complex Bayesian stuff isn't happening? No. It just means this is a more parsimonious model of the data. Nature isn't always parsimonious. It's not necessarily the best criterion for choosing something, but it's something that's important. Okay. How about chunk formation? That's another elementary kind of learning mechanism. Form a chunk. What's a chunk? Well, it's whatever you bind together, usually, for example, through an intentional focus. And what we see, for example, is that chunk formation, which is relatively simple, and I'll demonstrate in a moment, can often explain the data just as well as the elementary associative learning mechanisms, and just as well as the Bayesian mechanisms. In fact, I'd argue right now that there's a pretty large groundswell within the statistical learning literature pushing more toward a chunk-based interpretation of statistical learning, at least within the language domain. Okay? Now, I will go back to Scott's talk, and he was talking about the power of something relatively simple, like n-grams, to do more complicated things, like NLI. And so, in this kind of situation, you start to have to ask yourself, whoa, chunking, n-grams, simple units, that's pretty powerful, it seems like. And that is the case. And I want to show you what I mean when I talk about these kinds of chunk-based mechanisms, just so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm going to give you guys a demonstration through one particular kind of chunking computational model of statistical learning. This is from a model called Parser, which was developed by Pierre Perrichet and Annie Venter. Hypothetical scenario. We're going to look at speech segmentation or word segmentation. So I've got 3 sample words, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, H, I. And I've got a continuous running stream of speech. Okay? So if you're just looking at this continuous speech stream here, you don't necessarily know where the words start or stop unless you've been given prior knowledge about what the words are. So what happens in this chunk-based statistical learning model is you have an attentional window. That's the little red box you see there. And you can parameterize this any way you want to, but as a general rule, it fluctuates between, let's say, 2 or 3 letters or phonemes or units wide. But you can set it to whatever you want to set it to, and it can kind of fluctuate there. And what happens is in each given moment, your attentional window falls on some bit of the input. So, for example, at the moment, it's on GH. That forms a chunk, GH, in memory, which is given a memory strength. Here it's 1. And then we move on, because it's important to move on in life. We move on to ID next. Okay? So now we have a second chunk in memory, ID, and we've started to forget the first chunk. Forgetting is built into the system. If you don't encounter something very often, forgetting it is probably not a huge deal. Keeps on moving. Now we've got a third chunk. The attentional window just happens to be larger on this particular slice. So we have a chunk now, EFG, which you'll note does not actually correspond to any real word. Okay? And then we move on and we have HI. And we see that we're starting to forget things like GH. Then we move on and hey, wouldn't you know it, just by luck, our attentional focus lands on an actual unit, DEF, an actual word. Okay? And because it's an actual word, the probability of landing on it again is pretty high. All right? And then we move on, and we get GH again. Now what happens here is GH, which on the previous time slice had a relatively lower memory strength, when we encounter it again, it goes, hey, this thing's important, strengthen it. That's it. Okay? This is a relatively simple, chunk-based learning mechanism. And what we see in study after study is that this is usually just as good as the connectionist networks and the more complex Bayesian stuff at explaining the data. It has its limits, a lot of limitations to it in terms of like how you scale it up to bigger things like abstract syntactic structures and those kinds of things. But the principle is still there and still broadly the same. Okay? So that's how you can go for something like chunk formation, explaining a lot of your data. So that's one thing. All right, simple learning mechanisms like associative learning or chunking seem to actually explain a lot of the statistical learning data. The last thing I want to point out here is that statistical learning seems to be tied into memory systems that we already understand pretty well. All right, we see that declarative memory substrates are important for statistical learning, especially the hippocampus and other medial temporal lobe structures. We also see that procedural memory plays a role. Right, now that's getting a little bit tricky here. All right, because we already have reason to believe that these different memory systems play unique roles in language. And now we're seeing that they both contribute somehow to statistical learning. Now this isn't really a problem for us, but it's something worth understanding. And as much as these memory systems involve things like prediction and error-based learning, which they do, then they can both be said to be statistical learning kinds of mechanisms. In other words, and you can ask Michael, he'll agree. That doesn't make it right, it just means he'll agree. But statistical learning is the fundamental learning mechanism that happens in both of these memory systems. Now, it might be different statistical computations. It might operate over different kinds of representations. But you can think of both of them as kind of doing statistical learning. All right? And that's consistent with the data that we actually have. Okay. Again, just to recap the whole idea of implicitness, because I don't want to lose track of it entirely. Inasmuch as we've been talking about statistical learning as computations of statistics, it has to be implicit. If we're talking about chunk formation, could be implicit or explicit. I would argue that although I showed you an example where it could be explicit, there's no reason in principle why it couldn't be purely implicit. And the resulting knowledge can be implicit or explicit, as I've shown with my research with Patrick Hirschat, as well as a colleague, Anna Franco. All right. Let's bring things together here. Okay. I want to note before I go too far here, kind of dovetailing with Scott's point here, that implicit learning, statistical learning, have often suffered a similar fate to cross-linguistic influence and transfer research. In the 50s and 60s, we were issued hard times in transfer research. And inasmuch as we're throwing out associative learning-based accounts of language, which was things like Skinner, and some of it needed to be thrown out, we sort of lost our way a little bit. Okay? Statistical learning hasn't been in vogue for a long time, in part because, thanks Noam, and his wrecking ball that he applied to both us as well as transfer. I'm not mincing my words here, this is how I actually feel. We also had hard times for transfer and statistical learning in the 70s and 80s, thanks to Krashen. Again, not that they didn't make important points or move the field forward, okay, but there was a bit of a baby bathwater kind of situation, all right? And so important insights about transfer, about CLI, about learning the distributional properties of language kind of took a back seat. Christina Sanz, in one of my graduate classes, I believe it was instructed SLA, said, there's always a pendulum swinging in the fields, right? The pendulum was swinging that way, not our way, okay? With any luck, we're pulling it back this way for a while, and we can enjoy it while it lasts, all right? So, with that said, what are some tangibles? Things that I thought about that, maybe this will allow us to sort of merge a little bit more here. Some things that seem relevant for CLI or transfer research. First off, I'll point out that prior knowledge, surprise, surprise, influences statistical learning. And I'd like to demonstrate one example of this for you guys. And I'd like to use, again, speech segmentation, just because it's been done so much, we've studied it so much, we've replicated it so much, we really understand it pretty well. So, in a classical statistical learning study on speech segmentation, we present participants with a speech stream, unsegmented, no prosodic markers whatsoever, and this is sort of a visual representation of that, of just artificial language words, okay? And we ask participants to learn this. With adults, we can say, hey, learn this. With infants, 8-month-old infants, we just expose them to it, and they still learn it, okay? And what they ideally will pick up is where the words start and stop, okay? So we see, we have 4 words here, Pabiku, Golatu, Daropi, and Tibudo. Now, the only cue for learning these are transitional probabilities. We come back to this idea of transitional probability. So just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, transitional probabilities within a given word is 1.0, meaning if you hear the syllable pa, there is a 100% probability it will be followed by B, and B will always be followed by ku in this particular set of stimuli. the transitional probabilities between words, so for example, between papiku and golatu, is 0.33, and that's because you have a given word, papiku, and it can be followed by any of the 3 other words in the stimulus set. Okay? Now, the logic here is pretty straightforward. In language, in actual natural language, the transitional probabilities within words are usually higher, not always, but usually higher, than the transitional probabilities between words. So, for example, in something that an 8-month-old infant might hear, pretty baby, the transitional probabilities between pre and d is higher than between d and bay. And bay and b is higher than d and bay as well. Okay? Now, taking this classic paradigm, which has been replicated to death, Felicia Arnaud and colleagues were interested in, well, what role does prior knowledge play here? Okay? And so they took 2 groups of participants. The canonical group doesn't do any pre-training, they just go through an exposure phase and then a test phase. The part word familiarized group gets the last syllable of one of the target words attached to the first 2 syllables of another word, okay? Forming sort of fragment words or partial words. And they'll get just some of these, okay? Then they're given an exposure phase. Again, unsegmented speech stream with no prosodic cues. The only cues to learning here are the statistical ones that are inherent in the input. And finally, you give them a test phase. You give them a real word like papiku, and you give them a non-word or a part word like bupabi, and you see how they perform. Importantly, these non-words were not among the familiarized items. Okay. And what do we see? Well, we see on the right-hand side there the performance of a traditional speech segmentation statistical learning group. They perform significantly above chance, and the vast majority of participants are above chance in terms of the overall distribution. We see significantly below chance performance, though, in the participants who are familiarized with these part words. So they're not just guessing, they're systematically getting it wrong. Okay? And what this means, seemingly, is that if you have prior knowledge that's incompatible with the statistics of the input, that's going to curtail the statistical learning. Okay? So statistical learning does not trump prior knowledge. We know this from all those studies. And that's just a subset. Okay? So statistical learning definitely happens, right? But it is not the primary learning. Other things can curtail it, can emphasize it, can exaggerate it, can worsen it. Okay. All right. So that's one thought about how, again, prior knowledge, CLI, those kinds of things could kind of start to merge. Something else, and I modified this slide in real time as Scott was talking because it seemed really important. I originally just said statistics are context dependent. Okay? And what I wanted to point out, for example, was that words are more statistically informative if they're experienced in diverse contexts. Not only my work with my colleague Nick Ponder, but many, many people have shown this. What you see over here is just sort of a visual representation of that. What you have is a bunch of different English words, and their frequencies being darker blocks across different documents at the top. Okay, a word by document matrix. All right. If a word appears in a wider or more diverse range of documents, compared to a word that appears in fewer documents, even if they have identical actual frequency, the words that appear in a more diverse range of contexts are processed more quickly. Okay, they're processed with less effort, and we also see they seem to be learned a little bit better. Okay. Now, that's just context. Extend this out to what Scott was saying earlier. For example, with all the time and most of the time, well, the statistics are language dependent. Statistics of the L1 are not the same as the statistics of the L2. I knew this trivially going up to today, but I hadn't really thought about it in the way that sort of Scott brought to my attention. And so it seems to me that these kinds of contextualized or language-specific statistics are going to influence how things like transfer and CLI get expressed. I'm not fully sure how yet, but that might be one of the fruitful points of collaboration. Finally, just big picture thinking here. If prior knowledge shapes our statistical learning, okay, and we know that prior knowledge can reduce or impair our subsequent statistical learning, then this seems like those kinds of situations where you're really going to need explicit learning or instruction, explicit instruction, noticing, all those kinds of things where the teacher or some sort of intervention is happening. Because statistical learning isn't just following its normal course. Okay? So the real big thing for me here is that if you have transfer or CLI phenomena coming from these kinds of things, explicit learning, explicit instruction, or any kind of those things, which, by the way, often have a very fast learning rate. I would say that these seem like they should be different than the CLI or transfer phenomenon that come from actual transfer of statistical knowledge into the subsequent statistical learning process. In other words, transfer or CLI that you see from classroom instruction, from rapid learning, which could be explicit instruction, it could be fast mapping, things like that, seems like it would be different than the kinds of transfer or CLI that would happen from aggregating tons of input and doing the statistical learning on that input. Okay? I'm not sure what that means yet. Hopefully we can discuss it and kind of come to some conclusions about that. But it seems like those are very different things, and it seems like that's a good jumping off point. And I would finally note that these consequences, by the way, although I'm talking about them here in terms of statistical learning, can easily be reframed with an implicit or explicit or declarative procedural reading too. Okay? So what I'm saying here is an exclusive in its conclusions. And I'm happy to talk about how those might play out too if anyone has questions. But I'll stop for now and turn it over to you guys.